Thank you for that. Thank you for coming to see my talk. I'll be presenting a paper which forms part of the work that we've been doing at the University of Southampton and the University of Oxford around the quantified self and its greater uses within healthcare services. So I'd like to thank my co-authors, Richard, Mark, Max and Nigel. They're also my supervisors. And this forms the final part of my PhD thesis, which is why I'm looking for a job. This paper is a follow-up to a paper that I presented 2 years ago at CHI. In that paper, we analysed how doctors work with data from consumer fitness devices, like this one, which is a step counter. So we found that doctors had trouble using these kinds of data because they weren't sure about the data quality, time constraints, and unfamiliar data structures. So we wanted to revisit those barriers to think about why they happen. So for this paper we're presenting today, we thought, how about we ask doctors in a variety of different settings like cardiology, oncology, audiology, about these sorts of devices. In particular, we looked at how some of these barriers appear within a workflow, so how doctors actually work with patients when it comes to using this data. So what do I mean by patient-generated data? Well, we take this to mean any kind of data that a patient has recorded using their own means. So we know that today there are a lot of people out there tracking some aspect of their health. This could be through popular consumer technologies like Fitbit or smartphones, or it could be through journals, including handwritten journals and electronic journals. We count all of these as forms of patient-generated data. And it's important that we research these devices because there is a growing market for consumer health technology. These devices are potentially a great source of data describing an individual's health. About a third of adults in the US track at least one indicator of health using an app. This includes weight, symptoms, heart rate, sleep, etc. And last year, over 15 million Fitbits were sold. Fitbits can track physical activity, heart rate and sleep. So there are many of these kinds of self-tracking tools, and we wanted to find out what the value for them, what the value to doctors are for these sorts of devices. So we suspect that these data could help overcome some of the challenges that healthcare is facing. We're living longer, but this means that more people will experience chronic illness, and chronic illness tends to require a more personalised treatment plan. So we've seen diabetes increase about 4 times in the last 40 years, and the number of people with heart failure is expected to increase by almost half by 2030. This adds up to an increased need for personalised care, and that means we need more data about how patients live and just to make chronic illness more manageable. So there is an increasing body of research around patient-generated data, especially in the past few years. A few key visions for patient-generated data are set out in the book Self-Tracking. The data could be used for personalizing medicine for individual patients. It could be used to fill the gaps between visits so that doctors can see how patients' condition has progressed between consultations. This is important because, as Matthew's talk just outlined, significant clinical events often happen outside of consultations. And this sort of data could also help predict or have an early detection of health abnormalities. Chung et al. 2017 interviewed clinicians on the use of lifelog data specific to irritable bowel syndrome. They uncovered that patient-generated data act as a boundary object where collaboration around shared information requires knowledge and expertise from both the clinician and the patient. And they found that patient-generated data can actually empower patients to take a greater part of their healthcare decisions. And last year at CHI, Mentis et al. Observed that doctors using Fitbit recorded by patients also revealed that the use of patient-generated data is a collaborative process in which doctors and patients have to work together to form a mutual understanding of their data. And in our last CHI paper 2 years ago, we got doctors to role play that a patient presented with a set of symptoms and also provided some data that they'd recorded. We then asked them to take us through how they would reach a diagnosis, and from this it emerged that patient-generated data gets used much like other forms of clinical evidence. It is evaluated to decide whether to admit it or not as evidence. But this brought up a problem. Doctors were not confident that the measurements were accurate. For one, the devices used to record the measurements were unknown. And secondly, the patient's motivations for taking the measurements were also unknown. So there was problems relating to how the data was represented and a lack of confidence in the measurements. And this took us to a new research question. What are the common barriers to using patient-generated data in clinical workflows? And there's two important parts to this question. First, when we say common barriers, we mean barriers which occur over different clinical contexts. For example, barriers which might appear in both cardiology and audiology. And second, when we say workflows, we're thinking about whether these barriers appear in a certain stage of a clinician's work. So we think of a workflow as the order in which work that is conducted and how the actors interact. And in this case, we're considering three actors: a clinician, the patient, and the patient-generated data, which could be on a wearable device, on a smartphone, or printed out. So our method for studying this was twofold. First of all, we did a literature review to identify barriers around different clinical settings that were found in prior work. And second, we did semi-structured interviews with doctors to understand how these barriers manifest within clinical workflows. For our literature review, we started by selecting several databases and searching them for terms like quantified self and patient-generated data. And this gave us 1,218 results once duplicates were removed. Then it was a case of just filtering through them, mostly just through looking at the title, just to conform to our inclusion criteria, which were that it had to report original findings on clinicians' lived experience of using patient-generated data. So for the most part, I was just looking at titles. Sometimes we had to look at the whole papers as well, reaching a final 22 papers, which we then reviewed. We used a thematic analysis approach to identify any significant common themes between the papers. And so, as you can see from this table, there were quite a lot of themes, 12 themes in total. I won't go through all of them, but three which I think were quite significant. Structure, which is where the paper discussed difficulties of the doctors using data structured in ways unfamiliar with them. Quite a few papers also brought up reliability, which is we're not clear if consumer technology is sufficiently clinically tested. And also a lot of papers brought up that clinicians simply just don't have enough time to working with these kinds of data. So this gave us an initial feeling for how a lot of these barriers sort of occur in different clinical settings like chronic illness and oncology. For the interviews, we recruited 13 clinicians using three criteria. They were a certified healthcare professional, they worked regularly with patients, and that the sample would reflect a sort of broad spectrum of different clinical roles. So our final sample included cardiologists, mental health specialists, nurses, several other common clinical roles. And all of our participants were practicing within the UK. And we wanted to ask about their lived experiences, so we aimed to elicit their perspectives on patient-generated data. We asked questions around their clinical background and relevant contexts, their typical encounters with patient-generated data, how they would evaluate and use such data, and how such data might impact their work. Using a semi-structured approach meant that we could go off topic and explore things we hadn't anticipated, and also meant that we could explore individual settings like audiology and cardiology. We transcribed those interviews and then coded the transcripts around how patient-generated data gets used. We consolidated those into themes, and it emerged that participants expressed that using patient-generated data is part of a workflow of several distinct stages. So we ordered those stages chronologically, and we used the workflow elements model to consider the actors, artifacts, and the actions taken. From this, we learned that many barriers we saw earlier happened at distinct stages of the workflow. So what did we find? Well, we found that there were 6 distinct stages that a clinician worked in when using patient-generated data. First, aligning patient and clinician objectives. Second, evaluating data quality. Third, judging data utility. Fourth, rearranging the data. Fifth, interpreting the data. And finally, deciding on an actionable plan. And as I'll explain next, this was very much a collaborative process between the clinicians and the patients. So for the first stage, doctors raised that there were ways that they would work with data that is impacted by the patient's motivation for recording the data. We saw that in prior work with patients who may have been trying to force a particular diagnosis by recording certain types of data, which could hint to an underlying condition like depression. Or it could just be that the patient is just interested in certain aspects of their health. We found in our previous study that patients recording their own health data are often engineers. So we perceive this as a misalignment of objectives between the doctor and patient. Again, this relates to the motivation of the patient and the objective of the doctor. Why did they focus on the recording when, say, their blood pressure was okay? And the doctors had a way to resolve this ambiguity. They aimed to craft mutual objectives for the consultation by having a discussion about self-tracking. We saw this as an initial step in a collaborative process with the patient. And the second step is where we saw clinicians discussing how they would evaluate the quality of patient-generated data. Quality was seen to be unclear because the patients were often using devices that were unknown to the doctor. But there was also a tendency for the data to be incomplete. So, for example, a patient may have recorded their heart rate every morning, afternoon and evening, but occasionally did not fill it in. Why not? Did they forget? Were they ill? Were they busy? This led to an ambiguity in using patient-generated data. The third workflow stage involved judging the data utility. That is, how could the doctor make use of this information? The relevance of the data depended on the context they were used in. So sometimes the data wouldn't be so relevant and therefore wouldn't be so utilizable in the current condition. A fourth stage involved the rearranging of data into a more familiar format. An interesting observation here was that many doctors would be quite pleased with patients for recording information in a format that makes sense to them. This was particularly in longer-term care settings where patients may benefit from taking a greater role in self-management and learning more about their health. And stage 5 involved doctors interpreting the patient-generated data. The subjectivity of data can be quite important here, as we heard earlier. In cardiology, this can determine whether a patient should undergo a procedure and was seen to be more important than any objective measurement of symptoms. And finally, for the final stage, deciding on a plan or action, doctors mentioned that where patients record their own information, they gain more knowledge into their own health, and the result of that decision-making process can become more collaboratively. So, all in all, there were quite a few barriers that occurred in our study, and we ordered those by the workflow stage that they appeared in, and this allowed us to think more about the design approaches we could take to resolving some of these barriers. So let's now consider how we could overcome these barriers. We found that data is often incomplete, so how can we improve that? Well, one obvious way would be to automate data collection to reduce the burden and improve compliance. The Apple Watch, for example, uses sensors to record physical activity, but not all forms of data collection can be automated. Mood, for example, is quite subjective, and you probably can't easily sense that. Another idea might be to use goal setting, so motivate people to record data through goals and rewards. These possible ways could improve compliance and therefore improve data completeness and the value of this data to doctors. A second area of design could be around the use of clinical tools for interpreting patient-generated data. So we heard that information can often be unfamiliar structures and take too much time to use. So here is an interface which we're co-designing with 4 cardiologists, and this can be used to visualize data from consumer health devices. It is for managing long-term heart conditions and draws on the clinical standards for displaying information. So just to summarize what I've talked about, we aim to identify barriers to using patient-generated data in different clinical settings. We found that doctors often follow a workflow for utilizing patient-generated data, And understanding this workflow could help address barriers through design and HCI research. I hope you enjoyed this talk. Thank you for listening, and I'll take any questions.
Questions, anybody?
Hi, my name is Helene Rutjes. I'm from Eindhoven University of Technology. Thank you for your talk, very interesting. I was wondering, so you take data as a thing that influences the doctor-patient relationship and the way they collaborate. Data is in a sense quite passive. And I wonder how you would think that these barriers might change if the data is more taking an active role. For example, more analyses which result in more e-coaching types or maybe concrete recommendations, or the technology would take other roles, for example, helping the doctor to see the non-verbal cues of the patient. So when you take data a bit more abstract, more global towards technology, maybe, would you think that the barriers might change or be the same, or?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, you mentioned like the non-verbal communication there as well, which is, we spoke to doctors and they said they can tell a lot about a patient based on them just walking into a room. So obviously, there's a sense that data can be quite different between different circumstances. I think it's very difficult to generalize barriers across every possible scenario. And a main limitation of our work here is that we only considered certain types of data and certain types of clinical settings. So there's a lot of clinical settings that we did not consider. So yeah, I guess to answer your question would be probably some of these barriers would be consistent throughout lots of different clinical settings, and other ones maybe not. Does that answer your question?
Well, yeah, more or less. I would be also interested in if you would pick, so the reason that you pick this type of data and this type of context might be because it maps to a need of a doctor. So is this really the thing that they need most, this type of data and this type of context? Or do they might need technology that is presented in another way, which might help them even more? So is the implicit reason maybe why you've chosen this context and this type of data that you think that this helps them best?
Are you talking about the nature of data collection or the nature of using data? So it's the specific type of data that we're working with?
Yeah, the last thing, the decision that you make to work with this type of data.
Well, I suppose the importance of this kind of data is that it's recorded by the patient over a long period of time, as opposed to being recorded in a clinical environment at small windows of time. And with chronic illness, you're dealing with a long period of time. Yeah. So it's important to have that longitudinal data source.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, Sean Munson from University of Washington. So I really appreciate the focus on the common barriers here. I was wondering if you could maybe riff a bit on some of the less common barriers or the ones where it depends on the particular condition or maybe who initiated it. So what are some of the perhaps distinguishing factors and what other barriers you might see or how to anticipate barriers or plan for them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so probably the biggest distinction between two different clinical settings is whether it's acute or chronic. So for instance, in acute settings, time is much more of an issue. So you just don't have the time to be looking through reams and reams of data. Whereas the clinicians we're working with in long-term management, particularly in heart failure, they have a lot more time to look over individual patients. So there's that aspect of just having the time to decide whether they're going to use the data, to analyze the data, and to interpret it as well. So yeah, definitely there's some major differences between clinical settings. And I think somewhere here where we go into them, for example, data lacks context. That is around if, for example, someone's recording their blood pressure, what were they doing when they took their blood pressure? So were they standing up? Had they just gone for a run? All of these kinds of things is very important to a long-term chronic care condition, but less important for an acute setting because they will typically be doing it at that time, there and then.
Thanks.
Please join